I received a message from a viewer and they asked me for a favor. They wanted me to make a video on how to replace the trigger on a Stihl FS38 or FS45 because they're basically the same. I told them I just had to pull the trimmer out of storage and film the repair, but when I got to the storage I realized I had made a huge mistake. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is the Stihl FS45 trimmer, and there really isn't a problem with it because I think I already fixed it in a previous video. However, I'm having a hard time finding that video. I'm not going to worry about it at the moment because at the request from a viewer, we're going to go through the steps to replace the trigger. The huge mistake I mentioned earlier was that I left fuel in the tank, and now I'm worried that I might have damaged the carb. So I have a video on this trimmer from when I first picked it up, but not any later videos. So what happened was, sometime last year, I had seen an ad where someone was giving this away, along with a McCulloch chainsaw, a stainless steel kitchen sink, and a spare tire. However, that was over 7 months ago, which I know that doesn't sound like a long time, but if I knew I wasn't going to use it in a month's time, I would always recommend that you drain the fuel tank and the fuel system for extra insurance. That way you don't have any carb issues later on. Now, after I go through the steps to replace the trigger, I'll then try starting it and hopefully it runs fine. Otherwise, I'll have to take the carb apart for an inspection. Now, as you can see, the trigger is not broken on this trimmer and it's working just like it's supposed to, but that doesn't mean I can't show you how to replace it. I think the reason they wanted me to go through this process is that sometimes a repair shown in video can offer a bit more clarity than pictures alone. Now, the first thing I want to do is to empty the fuel tank, and the reason is that I want to have 0 chances of a fuel leak. Now, we have to have this trimmer on its back to get to the screws that hold the plastic housings together, and even though I know the fuel cap is sealing well, I still don't want to take any chances. There will be a total of 6 screws that we'll need to remove so we can split the plastic housing for the engine. There is a 7th screw that you can remove, but it's optional because it's for the shaft. The last screw may not come out of the housing like mine did, but if it doesn't want to come out, I'm not going to force it. Once all the screws are loose or gone, I'm going to flip it back over so I can remove the upper plastic housing. Now, take your time removing this part because you don't want to break it. I'm sure they still make the plastics for this trimmer, but I hate to think how much it would be to replace it. Now, once the cover is off, I can see there's a fair amount of dirt and grease here from the shaft. Before I continue with the repair, I'm going to take a minute to clean it. It might not matter to most people because you'll never see it, but at least it makes me feel better knowing that I tried to clean it. Now, with the cover off, we still can't remove the trigger just yet because the safety lever and the shaft are in the way. To remove the shaft, just pull it away from the engine and make sure the inner drive shaft doesn't fall out of it. Once it's gone, we can then remove the safety lever and the on-off switch. After that, we should be able to see the trigger. Now that we can see the trigger, we can see how it works. The throttle cable is attached to the top of it, and there's a return spring on the shaft that it pivots on. Now the shaft is also how it mounts to the lower part of the case. To remove it, we need to carefully pry it on the shaft out of its mount. Just be very careful because you could easily break it. Once we get it loose, all we need to do is to push the lower part of the trigger through the opening. That way we can remove the large end of the throttle cable from the anchor point on the trigger. So here is the trigger, and like I said, there isn't anything wrong with this one, but the most common issue with these would be that the lower part would break off. As far as I can tell, it's not a manufacturing issue, but it's because it's just vulnerable to being hit by something while being handled. It's unfortunate because, from what I can tell, all of Stihl's affordable trimmers have this style of trigger, while their more expensive lineup has a different style that's almost impossible to break. Now at this point, I'm ready to install what would be the new trigger, which I have to say isn't very expensive. Some can be bought for less than $10, which is pretty amazing. However, once you see what the cheaper ones look like, it makes a little bit more sense. Now the cheaper ones are molded, but they have a very rough finish, which tells me they must be using a slightly different process to make them. Now the installation is of course the reverse of the removal process of reconnecting the end of the throttle cable to the anchor point on the trigger and then pressing the pivoting shafts back into the mounts in the housing. Before continuing the reassembly process, I'm going to test that the trigger works like it should, and this is when we have a slight issue. Now the first time I pressed the trigger, I lost all tension on the cable, which is not supposed to happen. So unless the cable broke, the only reason for the cable to become loose like this is that the other end of the cable has detached from the carb, which is what happened here. Luckily, to reconnect this end is really simple. We just have to move the throttle lever and then put the wire through the opening on this barrel. There's not a lot of room, but it's not too difficult to do. Once the end of the cable is back on the carb, I can now see if the trigger is working like it's supposed to, and as you can see, it seems to be working just fine. That means I can start reassembling all the parts for this trimmer by first replacing the safety lever and the on-off switch, followed by the shaft. I guess I could have replaced the shaft first and then the safety bar, but either way will work. Now, the most important part when reinstalling the drive shaft is that it's aligned with the opening in the clutch drum. The easiest way to make sure is to spin the drum until the drive shaft slides into it, otherwise you risk damaging both of them. As a final test to make sure it's connected properly, I'm going to spin the trimmer head. Now the clutch drum should spin as well, and as you can see, ours is spinning while I spin the trimmer head, which means the drive shaft is connected properly and we can finally replace the upper plastic housing. Now take your time when doing this, otherwise if it's misaligned, when you tighten the screws, you could damage part of it. What I do to make sure it's aligned is to look down the seam where the two parts meet and to make sure there isn't a gap anywhere. Once I'm satisfied that the upper part is sitting where it needs to be, I'll flip it over and start to replace the screws. Once all the screws have been replaced, I'm still going to check it one more time before I put fuel into the tank for its first start in several months. It seems to be working correctly, so it's now time for the fuel. Now don't get upset, but I'm going to put the old fuel back into the tank. The reason is I want to see how it's held up over the last several months in storage. Just as a reminder, this fuel is 89 octane mixed at 40:1 and it has no ethanol in it. It's also been stabilized as well, so I don't expect any surprises. So unfortunately it stalled, but I also noticed that the idle speed is a bit low for my taste. I'm going to slightly increase the idle speed by turning this screw about a quarter of a turn. So after increasing the idle speed slightly, it didn't stall like it did before, and it seems to work pretty well at full speed, although the idling is a little erratic. It appears the treated fuel left in the tank is still good enough to be used, but I'd probably add some freshly mixed fuel into the tank the next time I use it. It also means that it didn't hurt the carb, which is what I was worried about the most. To be honest, I thought replacing the trigger would have been more troublesome, but it turns out it really wasn't that bad at all, even when compared to other brands. If you want to reduce the chances of the trigger breaking during transport or handling, I would close the trigger with some tape. That way there's very little chance for it to get broken. So my question is, would you pay for a cheap replacement trigger for less than $10, or would you pay just a little bit more to have an OEM quality part? To be honest, I don't think it really matters, but I'm sure it matters to some of you who might be watching. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own project, and I'll see you in the next video.